Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers with Gary Jublin. Today we were recording from the very trendy inner city cafe, Cafe Katana. There are some people we're meant to meet in life. These are people who may come from completely different worlds, but in a strange way you share something in common. That is certainly the case when I met today's guest on I Catch Killers, Jarin Baigent, walking down the steps of St James Railway Station in Sydney about 12 months ago. I didn't know Jarin. She stopped me and introduced herself. Like me, she had just left the New South Wales Police. We only spoke for a short time, but it was clear we had a lot to talk about. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet up for a coffee in the near future. Before we had a chance to catch up for that coffee, I happened to be participating in a peaceful street protest one Sunday afternoon out the front of Sydney Town Hall. There are hundreds of mainly Aboriginal protesters. We're there protesting about the lack of justice for 3 murdered Aboriginal children. The crowd was chanting Black Lives Matter. Marching in the crowd was Jarin, her husband and children. Jarin and the family attended the protest rally to show solidarity with the murdered children's families. Today's guest on I Catch Killers, Jarin Baigent, is an Aboriginal woman. She's the first Aboriginal police officer who had grown up in and around the block at Redfern. Redfern was and still is a place that draws Aboriginal Australians from around the country. It has also been the epicentre of police community conflict. Given that fact, it's amazing she joined the police. Today the listener will get a fascinating insight of what it's like living in two worlds. In the short time I've known Jarin, she has taught me so much about what it's like to be an Aboriginal person in this country and the difficulties she faced policing her own people. We'll also talk about what's happening in the US with the killing of George Floyd and things closer to home with the incident with the young Aboriginal boy. So Jarin, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Hi Gary, thank you.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I didn't think we'd be sitting here like this doing a podcast.
Not in a million years did I think this was going to happen, but here we are.
Well, I think people are going to find it very interesting because, as I said, that you've taught me a lot, and I thought I knew a lot about Aboriginal culture and different issues that arise, but you've been very informative for me. But before we go on, and don't laugh, but my well-paid, highly professional legal team has advised me anytime I sit down and speak to someone that I'm recording the conversation. Why are you laughing?
I know where this is going.
Make sure you get permission that I'm allowed to record. Do you give me that permission?
I give you full permission to record this conversation.
Ah, thank for that. We can move on from now. I've had enough trouble in the last 12 months. Jarin, you've got an interesting story, and it's a very interesting story, like growing up in and around the block. And for people that don't understand, the block at Redfern was a meeting place of Aboriginals from around the country, and it was also fairly volatile with the relationships between police and Aboriginals in and around the area. And that's, in fact, the area that you grew up in.
It is, yeah. Yep, Waterloo, Redfern, yep.
What's your memories of your childhood growing up around there?
So I was born in Blacktown, and my parents were really young parents. And my great-grandmother and my grandmother, they're from Cowra, New South Wales, Arambi Mission, a little mission outside Cowra Township. And there was no work out there, and living conditions were really, really hard back then. So my family moved to Sydney, and you're right, Redfern was a meeting place. It was primarily an industrial area, so it was a place that Aboriginal people could get work. And over time, it grew to be a community, and it has become a national meeting place for Aboriginal people. So in my early years, when I was still in preschool, my mum was 16 when she fell pregnant with me, and my dad was only a couple of years older than her. Yeah. When they separated, my mum moved to Waterloo, and that's where I spent my childhood. I went to preschool on Everleigh Street, Marawina Preschool, which that particular preschool was the first Aboriginal preschool in the country, started by my family, and later went to primary school in the area. And, growing up, relationships with police were not great. I certainly didn't feel that a police officer was a safe person for me. And that relationship, no matter where you went, was always very tense. That the authorities were not a trusted place for Aboriginal community, and certainly as a child growing up, I felt that way.
Was that something you saw through the eyes of a child, like when you were very young? Is that, or was it what your family told you? How did you come to feel that the police weren't the people that you could trust?
I think it was, so my family, we found our house to have police visits inside it every now and then. My family was not immune to those things. During those interactions where police did come to our house, they ranged from things like breaking in, as our house would get broken into quite a bit back then as well. So it was during those interactions that I personally formed my own opinion as a child on what police officers meant to me and how I saw them. But added to that, I think, you're living in a community that feels tense and pressure around that. I grew up protesting. I grew up being informed about Aboriginal rights and lack thereof. And, my family were heavily political and involved in a lot of the fights that, Australia benefit from today. We wouldn't have Medicare without Aboriginal people fighting for healthcare. That was fought for by Aboriginal people because our healthcare was so poor. As a result, the entire country now benefits from that. So I grew up knowing these things. And also injustices that happen in community. I'm fully aware of those too. I think where it was different for me is that, or maybe not different, but where I was able to tap into a different lens is that, my family are also willing to work together. That's always been something that I've been raised on, is that, to move forward, you've got to work together.
When you're saying working together with the authorities, is that what you're talking about?
I mean, the goal is for a safe community. Yeah. And it wasn't that demonising police. That was never the goal. But, when injustice happens, it was about accountability as well. So having those conversations, and my family, particularly my grandmother, my aunties, my uncles, my great-grandmother, never scared to have those conversations.
And some, like your grandmother, Millie Ingram,
yep.
She's a elder.
She is,
and she's a very impressive lady as well.
She is.
And do you want to tell a few stories about her, just so the audience get a sense of the type of role model that you had?
Yeah, so my nan's, she's my favourite person. We're very close. I always get emotional when I talk about her. I don't know why.
You're allowed to cry. You're allowed to
I'm
cry.
not a crier. So she came from a mission outside of Cowra, my great-grandmother was an incredible woman. My great-grandparents both were. And my great-grandmother, a really strong advocate for Aboriginal rights, and that, obviously was followed up by her children. My nan has been a huge influence on my life. She, in her career professionally, like, she worked for Department of Aboriginal Affairs for many, many years. She was a councillor for New South Wales Aboriginal Lands Council, back out at Cowra. She's always been a key person in my life in not only educating but fighting for these things and really opening up the eyes of, I don't want to say that it's the other side, but open up other people's minds to what it is that Aboriginal people actually go through in Australia.
Yeah, because I think Australia, we look at ourselves as not a racist country. And you're laughing when I'm saying that, but I'm saying that's the feeling that Australians think they're not racist. And I learned a lot in my dealings with the Barraville community, and we'll talk through it because I want to run some things past you when I was investigating the murder of their 3 kids up there. But we do think it's the Australian attitude is a fair go, and sometimes racism or biases are under the surface, and I'm sure you've experienced that. I've seen that with the Aboriginal people I've got to know, and sometimes it can be very subtle, but
Yep.
It hits you in the face. You want to talk about some of the experiences you've experienced?
Oh, gosh. Where do we start with that? So I think racism itself, that word, instantly the emotions that word brings up, it's defensiveness. And once a person feels that they have to defend themselves, even though you may not actually be calling somebody a racist, but to use that word racism in Australia, people feel like they have to defend. As soon as somebody feels defensive, they switch off.
Yeah.
So you find yourself hitting this barrier time and time again. And racism in Australia is so layered. It's all the way from overt racism right up through to, like you say, subtle racism. You find it in places where it might be, being served at a restaurant, or it might, and you know, seeing plain differences between yourself and the next person, or it can be in places where when you want to talk about your experiences, you're silenced. That's a really key thing too. And I think when we're talking about systems, like if we're looking at systemic change, when you have Aboriginal people working inside these places that highlight issues that inherently are undertowed by racism, it's really hard to open up those conversations, because how else do you say that it's racist? You know, you can use all other different words, but ultimately that's what we're talking about.
I think, as you said, people are very defensive of it. No one wants to be accused of being racist. And when I went to Bowraville with the murder of the 3 children, and we'll reference this, so I'll just give the audience an understanding of what we're talking about here. Bowraville Mission is on the outskirts of Bowraville. It's a town that's on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, up near Nambucca Heads. In 1990-91, 3 Aboriginal children, Evelyn Greenup, Clinton Speedy and Colleen Walker, were murdered over a period of 5 months. They all lived on the mission. It was all on one street, and it was over a 5-month period. So that was back in 1991. I became involved in the reinvestigation in 95. And when we talk about racism, and this is how this impacted on me, I turned up there at the mission, and I'm a white fella going up to a mission in Bowraville. You're smiling now because you can imagine how clunky I would have been. And I was the big city homicide detective, turned up there in my suit and walked out onto the mission, and I just got paid out on. And not in an aggressive, it was almost they were laughing at me. And one of the first jobs I had was to go speak to a witness. And I knocked on the door, and it said there was a group of fellas out on the balcony sitting round, and they said, "Oh no, she doesn't want to talk to you now." And I've said, "Well, you know, I've said that we've made an appointment," and gone in there, and I walked in there, spoken, and got my ass kicked and sent out. And I walked out with my tail between my legs, and the fellas on the veranda just sat there and laughed and said, "Oh, you learn next time, mister," and stuff like that. But the point I'm trying to make, I went up there as a police officer. I thought I'm open-minded. I didn't think I was racist, but there were subtleties that I just didn't understand. And I would make appointments for to get statements from witnesses, and they wouldn't turn up. And I'd come from the city. If I make an appointment, I expect someone to turn up, and they'd just laugh and say, "Well, it's Koori time up here."
I was going to say, have you heard of Koori time?
Oh, most definitely. And in the end, I learnt that was the way. I'd just turn up and start having a few yarns with people, and find the person I'm looking for and sit down and have a chat. And I learnt so much. But the point I'm trying to make here is that myself, I didn't think I had anything to learn. Even with Aboriginal English, the communication, the way that communicated with the families, that they spoke English as far as I'm concerned. So what barrier to communication could there be? Stop laughing at me. I'm explaining that I have learned, but that's the type of thing, and little subtle things that I just picked up, that I went in there so naively, and I'm looking from a white man's eyes. You're looking at it from an Aboriginal perspective, and you would be more attuned to these little differences that we just don't understand.
Yeah, I think to go back to the beginning of what you were saying there, you know, like you're talking about any contact with police for community is sensitive, regardless of how confident an Aboriginal person feels in dealing with that. And the way our communities work is, you know, there's that build up of trust and respect, because it hasn't been there for so long. So they were probably trying to see if you were a person that they could trust, I'm assuming. Yeah. I know that, you know, like with my family, we've gone through things like that where you've got to build up that trust, because, you know, they're deeply traumatic stories that you're wanting to hear, and you know, that's the process as a police officer that I went through up in the Northern Territory, which I know we'll touch on later, in dealing with communities. But yeah, there is a definite way that Aboriginal people communicate with one another, particularly like in New South Wales. You know, in certain areas we have our way of speaking with one another. And during my career, so I was in the police force for 6 months at the academy, 13 years from start to finish, if we don't count iProud. And I can't tell you how many times I had an officer say, like, I have no idea what you are speaking about. I don't know what you're saying. My partner, who's non-Aboriginal, he has no idea half the time either. So,
Yeah.
And our kids, give it to him and pick on him about it. So, there is a definite way that we communicate. Yeah.
And with you're talking about the community and trust, and I know in Barraville I was fortunate. One of the elders, Auntie Elaine, took me aside and basically said, "White fella, you got a lot to learn." And she took me under her wing and became one of my closest friends. But just guided me through it because I spent 20 years or 25 years up there working with the families. But I learnt so much. But anyway, getting back to you joining the police force. So growing up with, let's say, a distrust of the cops, why did you decide to join the very people that you distrust?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's, for me as a person, as a kid, I thought I was pretty tough. God. But I think, and I always played sport. So, that kind of rough, environment, footy and stuff like that, soccer, whatever. It didn't matter what sport it was, to be honest. I played everything. So I enjoyed, that kind of disciplined space of training and so on. But my dad said it. My father's non-Aboriginal as well. So he said it to me. He was like, little girl, you just got an issue with authority. And he said that to me so many times. And it was to eventually make the decision to be a police officer. I think it goes all the way back to the beginning. And as I said, our family home in Waterloo would get broken into all the bloody time. And you just felt so disempowered as a kid. We didn't have much to start off with. So when your house was ransacked time and time again, it happened just before Christmas at one point. And we were lucky. We had a home and a good house and everything, but we just didn't have much. So it was kind of destroying. And when you ring the police for help, and I remember the last time it happened, police turned up, and my mum, who was a very young single mum, we were heartbroken that the house got done over again. And I remember I started cleaning up the house because, big tough kid. My job's to look after the family. And
how old were you at this stage?
I would have been about 8.
Yep.
My daughter's age now.
Yeah. You realise how young
I know,
you were.
it really hits you like that at the time. I think in my head I thought I was about 15.
Yeah.
But so I started tidying up just to try and make my mum feel better, kids' mind and everything. And I remember the police were in my bedroom because that was the point of entry. And I had a jewellery box, and I had picked up the jewellery box on the floor and put it back on the shelf. And it only hit me, I think, recently that jewellery box that I owned actually belonged to my great-grandmother too.
Right,
Which I still have. So, I picked up the jewellery box, put it back. Police were saying to my mum, this is where they got him, blah, blah, blah. And mum was like, okay, so what happens next? Will you take fingerprints? And they said, no, we can't take fingerprints because your daughter's basically contaminated the crime scene by cleaning up. And I remember he took his thumbprint and he put it on this jewellery box, and he said, see how easy that is? That basically ruins everything. So, your daughter's touched it, so we can't do anything. And I was devastated. I thought it was my fault that we weren't going to be able to find the person that did it, and all of these things that little kids go through. So,
and now knowing it's also untrue.
Absolute rubbish, and they just didn't want to help us.
Yeah.
And, those conversations, that was the other thing. Every time that we had contact with police, I did feel like it was always a no, like we can't help you because.
Yeah.
And you just felt really just pretty helpless and worthless, to be honest. I definitely felt that emotion as a kid. We're not important.
Yeah.
So I think over time, add that feeling with and experiences with the fact that I was, I thrived in sport and those sorts of things and had that fire and upbringing on making a difference. So in my head, it made sense that I want to be a police officer.
Yep.
I knew it was going to be tough.
Even at that early age?
No, it wasn't until later, I don't think. At that age, I remember thinking, they're not there to help us.
Yeah.
They help other people, but they don't help us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and that must have been soul-destroying for a young kid.
It was. Looking back on it, I think it was just more that it's just confusion. You just don't understand why you're not important, but other people probably are. Like on telly, people are important, but, no one can help us.
Yeah.
And, you see things on telly all the time, like houses getting robbed and the police come and help and they catch the baddie and that's the end of it. That didn't happen for us. So, I think it wasn't until later on that I really decided that it was something that I was genuinely going to do.
Right. And just before we get to the police, in those early years, did you see the friends, family and the community arrested by police and the conflict there?
Yeah, we had, our family all had interactions with police, of course. My teenage years were not nice times with authorities myself. I never really got into real trouble, but there were no positive interactions that I can remember thinking like, that's a trusted space for me or a trusted person, no. But as I got older, we moved around a little bit as well and my life definitely changed. But, it wasn't until – I didn't join until I was about 23.
Right.
Yeah.
What did your family think when you told them you're going to join the cops?
Yeah, that was tricky. Well, like I said, my dad thought that I was too rebellious and wouldn't be able to do it. He was like, I think you better go and join the army, That was his thing. But with my mum's family, it took a while to muster up the courage to say this is what I wanted to do.
You were actually nervous in the thought of telling your family.
Oath. Yeah, absolutely. Just not sure. I think the disempowerment and how hard my family had felt for generations around being disempowered and seeing injustices in community. Like, why on earth would she want to go and do that? Yeah, I did feel very nervous about it. Family members who interactions with the law that weren't great. But I was determined and I set my mind to it and no one was going to change my mind. So once I said I was going to do it, that was it. But the hardest part was ringing Nan and letting her know.
So what, and we had that coffee with your Nan, a very impressive lady, but what was her attitude when you told her you're joining the cops?
Yeah, I was too scared to do it in person because I didn't want to see her face. Yeah, I know I was. So I rang her up and I said, look, I've got to tell you something. I've decided I'm going to do this. And she said, oh, yeah, what? Thinking I'm asking her to go to lunch or something. And she said, I said, I've decided I'm going to join the police force. And the line went silent and she said, why don't you think about becoming a hairdresser instead or go and do something like that? And I said, yep, no, I'm going to do this. And she said, all right, well, we'll have to talk about it later. And, that was the end of the conversation. Yeah.
Was this after there was a few riots? We refer to them as the Redfern riots. Was this after the riots?
Yeah, it was.
So that would have even been, and because your grandmother was there during the riots? Yeah,
Nan has never been against the police. It's never been about that. So, and during the riots, her, I don't want to speak for her. It's her position to say that. But, it was about how do we get peace. So even post the riots, I think it took her a while to come around to it because I think she understood how dangerous it was going to be, particularly for me.
Yeah.
And how hard it was going to be. And it was. I can't sugarcoat it. It was hard.
Yeah.
But once she saw that I was determined and she knew that there was nothing that she could say to change my mind, I was going to do it, she threw her full support behind me and the entire family threw their full support behind me as well, which was huge for me.
And that would have meant a lot.
I don't think I could have done it without that support. Yeah. And knowing that people understood your why. And as you say, this was after the TJ Hickey riot.
Yeah.
So to make a decision.
It was at so the police and the Aboriginal community's relationships were at an all-time low.
At that point, I would say it would have been, I wasn't privy to the police relationship in Redfern at that point. Yeah. But, like in community, you know, people felt disempowered. And angry, at the death of a young man. So it was a tricky time, but once that support was there, that really changed my confidence, and it fulfilled me with that real sense of purpose that I was doing the right thing.
Yep. Now, we talk, and I want to take you for your first days in the police and your thoughts there. But just before we move on past there, because I've mentioned your grandmother, and I've talked about her as an elder, and she actually delivered the Welcome to Country at Gough Whitlam's memorial service or funeral service. Can you explain two things? And I ask these questions, and these are the type of things I learnt, but can you explain two things? What the role of an elder is within the community and how they become an elder, and also the Welcome to Country the message behind that.
Yep. So elders are recognised leaders in community. You don't necessarily have to be elderly to be an elder, but certainly it tends to be, obviously older people who are community leaders. And my nan is without a doubt one of the best community leaders I've ever seen, and she's certainly seen as an elder. And it's a person that, when there are issues with police or if there is people that need to make contact with community, it's generally to go to the elders and leaders in community.
Right. And the welcome to country?
So traditionally, so if you look at traditional country, you've got the Australian map broken up into states. That's not how Aboriginal country is divided up. And I'm not sure, I don't even know if most Australians know that, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I'm Wiradjuri. My family's Wiradjuri. We're the largest or one of the largest nation groups in New South Wales. Traditionally speaking, if you step off your own country and onto somebody else's country, you've got to ask permission. You go into someone else's house nowadays, you knock on the door, you ask permission to come in. It's the same kind of thing. So a welcome to country is a traditional owner welcoming you onto country. Now there's also acknowledgements to country because obviously this is how it looks modern day.
Yeah.
So people are now showing their respect because you've got, lots of Aboriginal people living all over the country, off country, on country, so on and so forth, and then non-Aboriginal people to do an acknowledgement, acknowledges that you are on somebody else's country.
Right, okay. Thanks for that, because I think a lot of people see it and give it some respect but don't truly understand what the message behind it is. So.
No, it's deeply important and it should be deeply respected.
Okay, so let's take the hard-to-control, strong-willed young Aboriginal lady that's grown up. We've seen the conflict with police and the community, and then you're down the police academy. How did that feel?
Yeah, it was. I was excited, really excited. I'd done iProud, or it was actually the course previously to iProud. So iProud was developed.
Just basically, yep.
So iProud, Indigenous Pathways Our Way Delivery is what it stands for. I actually did, it's a TAFE course essentially, and it's a pathway for Aboriginal people to get what's called the minimum academic requirement to be able to go to the police academy. So an equivalent would be for a non-Aboriginal person would be a uni degree or, school in a high school certificate.
Yeah.
You can even do it on life skills. But I think where iProud is key for Aboriginal community is that it's a precursor, it's an insight, a preview to what an Aboriginal person is going to experience, not only at the academy but as a police officer. And that is a huge transition for people in community. As you said, you highlighted Koori time. Yeah. That's just one thing.
So be on the parade ground at 8 a.m.
And don't worry, in my first week, I was late. I was yelled at by a very angry sergeant and made to do, I think it was about 30 push-ups in front of the entire Session 2 class, which was a solid couple of hundred people at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just that subtle difference of, you didn't quite fit into the program.
Oh, I had no idea about that stuff.
Yeah. And were other cadets or other trainees, were they interested in your background?
No, they weren't. There were other Aboriginal students there, and we really bonded during our time at the police academy. My sister, we are related bloodways, but we call each other sisters. We're that close now. Letitia, we met at the police academy,
right?
And we've remained sisters ever since. And we all really relied heavily on each other because there were things like, so in your first session at the police academy, one of the first topics that you have to do in a maths lecture is Aboriginal cultural awareness. And
how'd that feel?
It was awful. Yeah. It was a really harrowing experience. I'm not even going to lie about it. And I'm no wallflower. I'll speak up, And the other thing too is that I'm not out to fight everybody or argue. Like, you're there because you want to be part of a police force. So these are your colleagues or potential future colleagues.
And I could imagine the academy and a big class, and I can imagine it in the auditorium, and they bring that topic up, and there'd be some rednecks there making comments. And
that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And I'm fair skin. So I was sitting in the crowd by myself. It was a big auditorium, and one of the local mob was talking about Goulburn area and the significance of traditional country and talking about police relationships. And this person had been doing this for the academy for years as well, a well-respected person.
Yeah.
And, you know, the comments that were coming from around me and remarks and so on and so forth. But what people in the audience didn't know was that I'd connected with that person before they went to do their session. And it turned out we were related. Right. And he actually acknowledged me halfway through his lecture and pointed me out and had me stand up. Yeah. And the people around me were horrified because the things that they had been saying up until that point, I sat there silently, just absorbing what was going on. Yeah. And that was one of the first topics in session 1.
Right. That would have been confronting.
It was, but also what was conflicting about it was that we'd been celebrated by the academy, and at that time Ken Moroney was the commissioner, who I was fortunate enough to meet him, a lovely man, fully supportive of my career. Yeah. And he actually knew elders in Redfern, including my nan and my aunties, which unbeknownst to me at the time. But we were celebrated on that level as Aboriginal students at the police academy. They even did a newspaper article on us. Yeah. And then, you know, on the ground in our learning space, we were dealing with that. Yeah. So it was really hard because you didn't want to be critical of the organisation that you're trying to be a part of, but at the same time, at the get-go, you're experiencing this kind of lateral, I guess, there's that word, it's racism.
Yeah, it is, and people don't, it doesn't sit comfortable with people, and I'm sure the people that were sitting beside you didn't think anything of it until it was hit in their face when you stood up. Yep. Which station were you first stationed at?
Mount Druitt.
Yep. Oh, so you've gone into a busy area.
Head first, yeah. For me, it was important to go somewhere that I could learn to be a police officer. Yeah. That was key for me. But also, and I remember, you know, you pick your preferences, you get your 3 top picks, and I think I might have put Mount Druitt 1, 2 and 3 on mine. I was really keen to go there. Yeah. And I remember other police or students just saying, oh, try and swap it, like you don't want to go there. But also I wanted to go to an Aboriginal community that I wasn't known in, just so that I could, I guess, eventually work up to a point of confidence where I could be a safe person. Yeah. That was also important to me looking back on it.
When you say be a safe person, what are you meaning by that?
I wanted community to see me as a safe person.
So it's someone that the community could come to you?
Yeah.
The Mount Druitt Aboriginal community would feel comfortable coming to you to discuss issues?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
In hindsight, pretty naive to do that when you're so junior. Yeah. But at the same time, no regrets. You know, I learnt how to do that. But at the same time, again, it was an indication that from the start, and I look back, you know, I'm 37 now, I look back at when I was 23, it's an indication to me that from the start I understood my workload was going to be bigger.
Because of your Aboriginality?
Yep, because if I'm a safe person inside this organisation, community will want to see you.
Did you, at Bear, and it's not, and we've both discussed this before we started the podcast, it's not about bashing police, but it's about learning from things. Did you find racism in the force there?
I found racism throughout my entire career. Yeah. And it wasn't limited to one police station or one level of seniority. You know, I saw it at all stages. I did experience racism, and I kind of want to outline too that my years in Mount Druitt, I am still very close and good friends. You know, these people also, like, you become like family because you're working together in these environments. Yeah. So again, like you say, it's not about police bashing. It comes down to individuals and their own issues with race or whatever it might, prejudice, whatever it might be, their own beliefs. And what was really sad at the time is that I was working with people that had never met an Aboriginal person outside of or prior to going to the police academy. Yeah. So to go to the academy and then go and police in a heavily populated Aboriginal community, that's such a negative view on what Aboriginal people are. So, yeah, I did experience racism during my time. Things like, you know, there's missing persons posters of Aboriginal faces and have you seen this person, and I'd find my name written on one of the photos,
Right,
or
yeah.
things like that did happen. But I think on the other hand too, the people that weren't like that were not accepting of that behaviour. And it gave me an opportunity to laterally educate. So when I had an opportunity to do it, I would show people who my family were and what we did. And that would then, hopefully in their minds, trigger a question of how dare you paint us with those kinds of preconceived ideas.
Give me
or
an
whatever.
example of how you would do that, just a practical example.
Okay, so the Armouries in Surrey Hills, yeah?
Yeah.
At the time, during my service at Mount Druitt, or even...
The armoury, just for people that mightn't mean anything, where they store all firearms.
Yeah, like Het Police,
Yeah.
Sydney Police Centre.
Yeah.
We'd have to go to Sydney Police Centre, and you would have to regularly go and do things or whatever it was. You might have to go there for radio, whatever it is. If I had an opportunity to go to the city, I'd always take my offsider via Redfern and drop in at the Aboriginal organisations and say hi.
Yeah, that would have been cool for them.
And I had a colleague say to me, like, I didn't know. Like, I've never seen this side of Aboriginal people before.
Yeah.
And the question then becomes, well, like, what did you think we were, What did you think after going there? Oh, I think this is amazing. Like, how do we not know this stuff?
And see, it's interesting because we get a distorted view in policing, because if we're seeing the Aboriginals that you're seeing are the ones that have been in the charge dock or in trouble.
Yep.
That's your perception. So
Yep.
what you were doing was showing them there's another side to...
Yep. What was sad about that, though, was that there's strength in community in Mount Druitt too. You don't have to travel outside of there to see it, or, wherever people are stationed, whatever it might be. There's strength in every single community. You've just got to go and look for it, and not look at it through a negative lens. So in terms of Mount Druitt, there's some really strong leadership there. And, where I could, I would also link in there. The reason why I would do it through Redfern is because that's where my community is.
Yeah.
So that was the only reason.
You had an experience with your brother.
I did, yeah.
Out there. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, we can talk about that. My brother has, since a very early age, has had issues with police. He's, I would say, negative issues with police. And then as he's gotten older, he's had his own run-ins with police himself. During my years in Mount Druitt, he became part of my friendship group with other cops, and we were all good mates. We played footy, touch footy and everything together, and we were all part of a social circle, which I was happy for because it showed my brother the other side of police officers and, all good mates.
Yeah.
So I had invited him to a birthday party of one of the sergeants there, and it was at Penrith Panthers Leagues Club. And we'd had a good night. My brother's friend picked us up who, he was at home, hadn't been drinking or anything like that, so collected us from the club, and we decided to go through McDonald's drive-through. And my brother and I sitting in the back of his friend's car, and the car in front of us, all of a sudden this woman came out of nowhere and started punching the girl who was driving in the driver's seat at the McDonald's window, and just started really hitting her. It was, we had to have witnessed probably 5 or 6 blows before we even knew what to do.
So serious assault.
Serious assault. Brutal. My brother gets out of the car and goes over to her and pulls her away. And we didn't know these people. Next thing, who I assume was this woman's boyfriend, has come over to my brother and started assaulting him. My brother's not scared to have a go, and he defended himself and probably came out a little bit better. But when police turned up, they were fighting, and police just sprayed everybody.
Yeah.
At that stage, you've got two
Spray,
men.
they run with the
OC spray. Yeah, I was not involved in any of it at this point. What had happened was the woman had, by this stage, while police were there, had this stage in there assaulting my brother. So this man and woman are punching my brother up in front of me, and police turn up, spray everyone, and I'm standing there like, how to deal with this. They were clearly breaking it up. My brother and this other guy were, completely pumped up and enraged. And, I, at that point, tried to say to the police, this is what happened. And I didn't badge up, but I identified myself.
Yeah.
We were only the command over.
Yeah.
It all counted for nothing. I was told my brother basically got arrested. He was charged, and I was in a lot of trouble for what was seen as hindering.
And is that, do you think when the police have turned up and seen your brother, an Aboriginal, involved in that certain assumptions were made?
I think that certainly we weren't heard. Certainly our version was not heard, and I'll definitely say that. And at that point, I felt disempowered because I was offering what was factual information about, what would be an investigation, and it didn't matter what I said either.
It's the word disempowered, and that's something that came to bear a great deal in the Barraville investigation. And when I was speaking to the families, and the three families, they all had different recollections of when they reported their children missing, and when Evelyn, a 4-year-old girl, disappeared, and when her auntie reported her missing to the police, it was suggested that might have gone on walkabout. And what do you want us to do? And the 16-year-old Colleen Walker, it's a 16-year-old girl, she's gone on walkabout, and just didn't understand things, and the family felt that disempowered, and that's why they've been fighting for justice for 25 years. As an Aboriginal person and also an ex-police officer, can you understand where the conflict or where the failings might have been? Bearing in mind this is in the early 90s in a country town. Can you understand why they would have felt that way?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's about, different standards of care being applied to different people. Imagine your own child at that age and they go missing and you're told they've gone walkabout. That's horrendous. I'm a mother, and if my child went missing and I was given that response, where do you go for help? Yeah. What do you do after that point? Even a 16-year-old, like if you have a 16-year-old child, they're a child. That's your children. What
you just said there, where do you go after that? And that's what came through with the family. Like, that was their frustration. They protested in the streets of Barraville, and that got Peter Ryan was then commissioner. I think that was around 1995, after a person had been charged with the 3 murders, a white man, and or charged with 2 murders, I should say, and he was acquitted. And there was a protest in 1995. And I've spoken to the people, and I'd see footage of the protests, and one of the most, and she would get embarrassed when I'd pointed out to her, was Auntie Elaine, and she was at the front of the protest, and she was angry, and it wasn't violent, like things weren't broken and no one was injured, but there was so much anger and passion there, and I spoke to her about that, and she said that was the only thing that we could do to get people to listen. And is that, when you talk disempowerment, is that the type of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I felt that level of disempowerment. Yeah. I haven't lost a loved one under those circumstances, but I can only imagine how deep that pain would have run. And I think it's also like, when you feel pain as a human being, whether it's about anything, most people at some point will turn that into anger. So when you're talking about the loss of a child, let alone 3 children, how deep that pain actually goes. And then that's, if you're also on top of that, not being listened to, being disempowered, and nobody's looking for them. Aside from these family members, who's looking for these children? Like, there's no other option than to be angry.
Yeah. Well, that's the only way they could get attention. And I saw you at the last protest march, but I'd been in 3 other protest marches to Parliament House, and that resulted in a parliamentary inquiry where the politicians actually, and full credit to them, actually sat down and listened to the families and what the families had to say. And I still remember when it was, I think 2004, it would have been 2004, no, sorry, later, at the parliamentary inquiry, 2014, sorry, I've lost a decade. That happens when you've been in the police too long. The parliamentary inquiry, and the families gave evidence, and there's a parliamentary committee sitting there, seven people, state politicians, and it was a closed court because the families wanted to talk about the impact this has had on them, and they wanted to do it behind closed doors. I sat in there, and I must admit it was the second day of the parliamentary inquiry. I'd given evidence on the first day in an open court, and I thought, well, I've pretty much heard all this before in the families talk. there wasn't one politician that sat there that didn't have tears in their eyes, crying, to the point where some of them couldn't even talk because of what their families had experienced, because they talked about the racism that they'd experienced in the town. And when we're talking a murder investigation, people find it hard to reconcile, well, how did race play a part? But it was that type of thing, that disempowerment, where people weren't listening to them. They were saying, look at this, and people were just ignoring them. So I do get a sense of it, but if I didn't have the Bowraville experience, I would be still ignorant to it. And you must have experienced just time and time again, looking at it from the police point of view and then looking at it from an Aboriginal point of view.
Yeah, I definitely did. I think, going back to what you're talking about, that disempowerment too, you know, when you're talking to people and they say things like, I don't see colour, as though it's like a deep insight into the fact that they're not actually holding any racial prejudice or what have you. To not see colour is to not see the experiences that you're talking about.
Yep.
So to say something as broad sweeping as that without ever having experienced it, and you said it yourself, like you now have some insight into it because you've had to investigate in that space, without that experience, and then if somebody was to say something like that, it adds yet another layer, you know. So I think that Australia as a country has a really long way to go with this.
Well, and when we talk about the history, it's a relatively short history in the scheme of things. The 200 years that we're talking about since settlement here with white man, but the type of thing that we're talking about, your grandmother, Auntie Elaine, they were considered flora and fauna in our lifetime.
Yep.
And do you want to talk through that? Because I think people are just shocked when we talk that. People don't realise. Yeah,
I think it's minimising what's actually happened in Australia.
Yeah.
And, I've got children in school now, and I feel actually schools are really in between a rock and a hard place. Yeah. They're looking at truth-telling of history. So you're looking at things like stolen generations. People don't even want to acknowledge that really happened. I remember having an argument with a police officer, much junior to me at the time. Thankfully, I was able to get my say.
That always makes it easier.
Where his argument was that sorry days shouldn't be a thing because we've got Anzacs that haven't been acknowledged, and I don't know how that big long bow was drawn.
Yeah.
But when you're talking, it's like when you're speaking, you're saying things like children were removed from their parents because they were Aboriginal. It's like the words don't register.
Yeah.
It's like that deep pain doesn't register, and that goes back to such a lack of compassion, for one, but not acknowledging what impact of history has had on Aboriginal community.
Yeah. And therein lies, I think, the antagonism between police and the Aboriginal community, because quite often when those children were taken away, it was the police that were taking them away.
That's right.
And that's some of the elders at Bowraville pointed that out to me.
Yep.
Why don't you think we hate the cops?
Yep.
And I think Auntie Elaine's first comment to me when I met her, why would I trust you? You're white and a cop. Like that was, she growled at me. It was scary. She was terrifying. Yeah. And I've just gone, oh.
But I think on the flip side too, it needs to be acknowledged that Aboriginal people have been willing to work with the police since the very start as well. We've got black trackers, and the New South Wales Police Force history starts with Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
So if you look at those trackers, there's always been, there was resistance, and I think once we got to a point in colonisation, it's always been that Aboriginal people have to come to the table.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think that that's acknowledged in the police and community relationship either.
Your career from Mount Druitt, how long did you spend at Mount Druitt?
Between 4 and 5 years in Mount Druitt.
Well, that's a good grounding. So
had a good go.
Yeah. And where'd you go to from there?
From there, I went to surveillance.
Yep.
So I was covert for a little while.
Yep.
I wasn't there for very long. I fell pregnant with my first child.
That would be a good cover, but probably extreme.
It wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad one.
Surveillance
well,
officer.
It was funny because it wasn't bad. But then I moved on to Redfern, which is where the second half of my career was. So I went back to my own community.
You must have been a bit conflicted there.
Very.
Okay. Talk about that.
Well, I'd been through training for a solid couple of years out of uniform. So the goal was to not be in uniform. for a long time.
That's steering towards a detective or career in surveillance?
Yeah. I definitely wanted a career in that space at the time. That's where I wanted to do that for a while. But from the very first time that I made the decision to join the police, I knew that I was going to go back to Redfern to work with young people.
Yeah.
That was always the end goal. I just wanted to build my career up to a point of expertise so that I was equipped with the tools to then be able to be as the best that I could be when I went back.
Okay, that makes sense.
That was the goal. But also to prove to the organisation that I was good at my job, that I hadn't just stayed in one spot the whole time, that I had a host of tools and that I was a competent police officer.
Yeah. So Redfern, what years was that where you went back to Redfern?
I went back in 2012 and I took a role as a youth liaison officer, which was a far cry from the world I'd been in.
Yeah. How did the community, with you coming back wearing the blue uniform?
Oh, so the first day, my very first day at the command, Luke Frudenstein was commander, and he made me, I was in uniform, and he's like, all right, we're going to go down to the city and watch this presentation. So he'd already done quite a lot of work in community, which was good for me as well, to have a boss that had insight, and he wanted me to accompany him on a train in uniform through Redfern to the city to watch this presentation at, I think it was at Parliament House, and I was just super paranoid. It was a harrowing day for me, sweating bullets and who's looking at me and what's going on. But
because you certainly stand out in uniform, you can't hide.
No,
when you're walking around
exactly.
in uniform.
What happened was, I also didn't give too much warning to community that at that point I was going to come back as in uniform too. So I really had to kind of earn respect in that space. It's easy for community to say Jarin's a police officer somewhere else, but okay, she's here now. So I still had that family support though, and that was good. But it took a long time for me to get comfortable.
And did you have conflict with the community and policing, your roles? Did that,
as in the entire time?
Well, in the entire time, yeah.
There was conflict. I was faced with times where I'd come across, family members in community or what have you, and it was pretty funny actually. I remember one day, I've got a cousin who's really big guy, and massive guy, and he was doing something, and I was with a group of police officers. We had to do HVP, high visibility policing. And we were walking through a space one day, and one of the cops was like, "Oh, he's massive. All right, this is you guys do." And I just said, "Listen, leave it to me. All of yous go and stand over there and just let me handle this." No, Jarin, no, and they were really kind of worried because he was quite aggressive at the time, and I went over.
Was it to take action, to arrest, or just to move on?
At that point, it was just it was just a move on.
Yeah.
It was a move on.
So you've got this big angry
guy,
man.
And not happy.
Yeah.
He wasn't a happy customer at that point. He was pretty upset. And I called out his name, and he didn't see me. He literally just saw a uniform.
Yeah.
And it took probably half a dozen times for him to see me, but I had to yell at him, take my hat off, and use a different voice.
Yeah.
And say, "Look at me." "Oh, cuz, how you going? Oh, I didn't realise it. Oh, sorry," hugs, and that was it. And I said, "Can you just go over there?" Yeah, you're right. All right, I'll catch her. And that was the end of it.
Yeah.
And I hadn't told the other cops that I knew him or anything. I just was like, "Can you let me handle this?" And they
would have been impressed.
They were just staring at me like,
"What did you say to him?"
So, things like that where I think with police, some police forget that you just got to talk to people as humans, just connect on that level. But then on the other side, it was poignant because it shows that some people also don't see the person in the uniform either.
Yes, yeah, that's a point, isn't it? He's looking at the uniform.
Yeah.
You're nothing more, nothing less.
That's right, yeah.
It's interesting. And did you have any times with the family that they resented the fact that you were the authority figure around there?
No, I wouldn't say that ever happened to me. I'd been in the police force for probably 7 years or something at that point. And, you know, this is my family who I've got regular contact with anyway. And I think as you get older, you put in your boundaries yourself as well, and people around you understand what your expectations are. So I wouldn't say that I had any issues there. My family were fully supportive of me by that point. And I think because I work with young people, I was a youth officer, that was it was seen as a good thing.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's key to say that, you know, Luke Freudenstein and Shane Phillips and elders like my nan and community leaders had already decided at that point to take a step around the relationships with Redfern Police.
Well, they were doing, and it's widely publicised, the boxing at the PCYC and different things like
NCIE.
that.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. And, you know, that was community that took control of that. Community didn't want to see that relationship deteriorate again. And community leaders like Uncle Shane and Nan had long ongoing relationship building discussions with Luke Freudenstein as the commander and other police to make sure that something like that didn't happen again.
Yeah.
So I came in, you know, after
and
that
credit where credit's due. Like, because the police, the natural instinct is just, okay, well, you do this, we're going to do that and come in over the top. But they took a step back and thought, how do we sort this out? So
certainly
it took a
positive
change.
It was. It took a change from the top for that to happen. And because of that change, I was able to work effectively in community as an Aboriginal police officer. I don't know what it would have been like had it not been that kind of environment. I would expect a lot harder.
Were the young kids inspired by the fact that one of their own is in the police and doing a job?
Definitely. I got that a lot. And I would steer a lot of people to iProud, which was the course that I undertook.
To encourage more Aboriginal police officers.
Definitely. For that same reason that I joined, more safe people inside the system that can connect to community and build that trust. So, a lot of that happened. But then at the same time, I think it was also where I feel most proud of my career at Redfern and my time served or serving was that if a young person did come into contact with negatively with police, that I was able to understand the layers behind either their offending behaviour or how to connect them up with the right people in community, which is really key, and where their support was. So, for example, if you know that a young person isn't living with their parent, they may be the person of contact in that family may well be their auntie. It's likely to be their grandmother because grandmothers are pivotal in all Aboriginal families. So, like, having that lived experience myself in my own community, my own family, I knew how to find who that person was in the family. And it's just about going that extra little bit. And, you know, I think that's lost a lot when working with young people. Yeah.
Oh, and it's such a valuable asset you would have been to, and you don't have to say this, but I will say it because I'll say it from the eyes of a police officer, such a valuable asset to have that type of contact and understanding of the community.
Yeah, it's thank you. It did come up a lot. Like, it was to the point where if there was a young person or an Aboriginal person involved with police, you know, I would be called to speak to them, and oftentimes it was outside of my YLO role. Things like, you know, sexual assaults or serious incidents where people just wouldn't speak to anyone else. Yeah. That happened. That definitely happened. And it put me in a really tricky situation at times because I was not then able to be the lead person on that job. I would have to hand that over. And at points it would be handed over, even though I still would have done the job myself. Yeah. I still would have done it. But, you know, told that you've got to hand it over, and in that handover it's lost because they're not going to speak anymore. Yeah,
it's unfortunate. Did the police, how were you received with the police in Redfern?
Yeah, pretty good. Like, I don't know.
And I know I'm asking general questions, and there's probably individuals. Like, overall it might have been good, but it might be individuals.
It is. You know, like in any job, I think, in any place, there's varying degrees of understanding about Aboriginal people. Yeah. Those that had an understanding of who I was in terms of being an Aboriginal police officer, good. Those that had less of an understanding, not good.
And did anyone, did you experience anyone having a go at you? Or
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And how
examples?
that was. There was an incident that I called out, and from my perspective, it was it was racism. It had racial undertones to it, and I highlighted that. And the way that was handled was that I was the problem. And that was the rollout from that incident. And I think it's difficult when
You were the problem because you exposed it or brought it up?
absolutely,
And
yep.
can't we just deal with this by?
Well, I was sort of removed from the office and told I couldn't sit in certain areas and put in a separate office, and that.
And that's because you called someone out on something that you deemed to be racist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And, I think that it would have been handled differently if it happened again, but
Yeah.
that's what happened to me.
Yeah.
And certainly it was, that nearly broke me as a person, but also it went to the core of what I was trying to do as a police officer in any case, that if something happens, that you aren't punished for highlighting the fact that it happened.
Yeah.
That was a really tough time in my career, and that happened towards the end of my career too. So,
And did the person that you called out, did
Yep.
anything happen to them, or
absolutely
did they change
nothing.
their attitude at all?
No, entirely unapologetic, protected. If anything, they were able to carry on, and I became the problem. And that happened. Yep.
Look, at this time, I think we're going to take our 10-minute break, but when we're coming back, and just so you can get your thoughts around it, because of a few contentious issues, what's happening over in America, Black Lives Matter,
Yep.
I'd like to touch on that, and also the incident that occurred at Surrey Hills, because I know that's an area that you worked and you understand the community and the people involved, so we'd like to talk about that. And you're also passionate about steering young kids away from the criminal justice system.
Yep.
And certainly the high incarceration rate we've got of Aboriginal people, not just in the state but across the country. And you also worked on the intervention up in Northern Territory.
I did,
So
yep.
they're the things we'd like to talk about. So let's have a break, recharge your coffee, and back soon. I hope you've been enjoying our discussions. What we're discussing is a very difficult topic, but what I like about Jarin is she has answers, or at the very least possible solutions to these complex problems. Tune in to part 2 of my chat with Jarin Baigent, where we'll be discussing some very topical issues. This includes the Black Lives Matter protests and the recent incident at Surrey Hills involving a police officer and an Aboriginal teenager. Speak soon. I Catch Killers is published by True Crime Australia. Produced by Claire Harvey from the Sunday Telegraph and Dylan Adams at Made in Katana. I'm now an investigative journalist at News Corp Australia, attached to the Sunday Telegraph. If you like the podcast, please subscribe to our newspapers.